I'd like to welcome you all to my gun finishing talk. I always preface this talk with the statement that this is how I finish guns. I'm pretty adamant about how I do it, so it kind of sounds like I'm criticizing other methods, and I'm really not, but you know, I'm pretty set in my ways. So the methods that I use are what works for me. And I've been teaching this class now, I think, for close to 10 years, and the people that have taken the class have come back to me with positive results. So I think that my methods are pretty good. I will also admit that I am a bit of a mad scientist. I have a bit of a mad scientist approach when I'm doing this, and if you purchased a gun from me 10 years ago and brought me the gun and said, how did you finish this? I can tell you the steps that I probably use because I don't vary the steps, but I probably can't tell you exactly what I did. And that's because I'm constantly changing what I'm doing, finding better methods. And I like experimenting. I have a big cabinet at home, and in that cabinet, I'll go through today, you know, I have all kinds of different mixtures and things like that that I use when finishing guns. And you know, some of them I've pushed off to the side and I don't use anymore, and I generally don't mention those in the talks. And then I do some new things, which I will mention. My primary stain that I use both on maple, curly maple, and I even use it on walnut, is what we refer to as nitrate of iron stain. A lot of times you'll hear it referred to as AquaFortis. And AquaFortis is actually the acid that's used in making the stain, but AquaFortis is the period term for nitric acid. So when we see AquaFortis in period research, we're not really sure whether they're talking about the stain or the acid. A number of years ago, William Young, who provided stain for Track of the Wolf, named his product AquaFortis. And I'll talk about his product a little bit today. And so generally a lot of people call it AquaFortis, but it is actually nitrate of iron stain. And I make all my nitrate of iron stain. You can buy ferric nitrate crystals from a supply house and make a stain that is very similar, kind of gets similar results. I've never messed with it, and I'll explain to you why. I like making my own stain. I will also preface this by it's dangerous. You're dealing with acid, so you're going to have to use a little bit of caution, and you know, all the safety measures that come with that go along with that. So my basic formula for nitrate of iron stain, and I don't vary this a whole lot, is 4 parts water, 1 part Regent grade nitric acid. You're always going to add the acid to the water. Never add water to the acid. You'll get splash up. You're going to wear gloves. You're going to wear long sleeve shirts. You're going to wear eye protection when you're doing this. And you're certainly going to do this outside. You're not going to want to do this inside. I do it when my neighbors are away and the wind is blowing in directions of their house. You are going to generate red smoke. Do not breathe the red smoke. A close friend of mine works for the local environmental companies, and he came over to my house one time and he said, what are you doing? I explained to him what I'm doing. He's watching the red smoke boil off. And he said, you know, when I was in school, they gave us all these little things to remember when we were out in the field. And one of the big things to remember was if you saw red smoke, you were to run. Red smoke means run. So please, don't breathe the fumes. So what I do is you are going to generate heat. This process generates heat. I don't like generating high heat. I like low heat. So when I have, and the way you're going to do this is you're going to dissolve iron into this solution. And that is what is giving you the coloring. So I don't use steel wool. You'll see places where people recommend steel wool. They'll use lathe turnings and things like that. I don't like that because that gives you a reaction that'll actually could come over the top. It's very violent. It generates a lot of heat. And people that do that, a lot of those guys will make their nitrate of iron stain in an ice bath. I don't have to use that because I'm only using chunks of iron, probably nothing smaller than a ½ inch square. And by doing that, I get a very slow reaction. So I'm going to add my 1 part of acid to my 4 parts of water in my Pyrex dish here that I stole from my wife. And then I'm going to add an iron source. And one of the reasons why I like to make my own stain is I've discovered over the years that the type of iron that I put in there gives me a different color stain. So if you open up my stain cabinet, I have probably 6 or 7 different mixtures of nitrate of iron stain, always using the same 4-to-1 ratio, but each one of them has a different iron source. And so that gives me my palette of colors. I don't use any aniline dyes, any of the spirit-based dyes or anything like that, because to my eye, they all look the same. You can spot a gun that's been stained with those from far away, and it tends to fade over time. So nitrate of iron stain is light fast. So what I've found is if I use wrought iron, real honest to goodness wrought iron, I tend to get red colors out of my stain. So I will use different wrought iron sources. I found that if I use mild steel, I get browns. So by having those 5 different mixtures, okay, I can take a piece of the stock off the side and I can stain that stock with 5 different stains and I'll get different shades depending on what I'm trying to gain. So, temperature of the reaction, and I should preface this, I try to keep most of my methods as traditional as possible. So that's kind of why I initially got away from using the Laurel Mountain stains and things like that. And the other thing is I noticed that they tended to fade over time. So I have my 4 parts of water, 1 part acid. I put my wrought iron in, I'm outside, and I just let that sit. And it's going to look like it's boiling. That's what's going to start happening. Bubbles are going to start to come off, and it's going to look like it's boiling. If you throw steel wool in there, it's going to be like, you know, a rapid boil. But this is a nice gentle boil, red smoke comes off, and every couple of hours I'll go out, and if that iron is consumed, I'll add another piece of iron or 2. And I'll go back to work, and I'll let that consume. Generally, within about 24 hours, the bubbles have stopped. And so at that point, there's no more reaction. Now, is the solution still acidic? Yes. And I tend to like a stain. I think I get better results from a stain that's slightly acidic. So if you were to sit there and watch that, you know, every once in a while a bubble will come up, and that's telling you there's still a little bit of acid working in there. So at this point, I'm maybe 24 hours in. I'm going to take all of the big iron out and pour it off and try to leave as much of the sludge that you're going to generate in the bottom of the container. I'm going to put it in a mason jar. I'm not going to cap it. If you cap it, it's going to explode. So I put the mason jar on, I put the lid kind of loose, and I set it in my garage where I store my nitric acid that rusts everything in my garage, and I'll leave it there for a couple of weeks. And what that's doing is it's actually continuing to work on whatever sludge and large particles are in the solution. After about 2 weeks, I strain the whole thing through cheesecloth, and then I can put it in a clean mason jar, write my date on the top, and I put that downstairs in my cabinet where all my materials are. Now, everybody makes their stain differently. Ian Pratt, he puts his iron in and he leaves it in for months. And Ian does beautiful work. Herschel House. Herschel's stuff is highly acidic. The House brothers, they want their nitrate of iron stain to be really acidic. And the only problem with the real acidic stuff is the stock continues to change color. It turns black. And that's exactly what they want. That's the look that they're looking for. Herschel gave me some stain one time, and I can judge how acidic a stain is by how many times I have to replace the cap on a jar. And I generally replace my caps once a year. Herschel's I had to replace once a month. That's the difference in the acidity. So you do have to have a little bit of caution when you're using this. I don't have any trouble putting my fingers in it when I stain, but just be aware it still is a little bit acidic. So that's my basic stain, and I have 5 or 6 of those that I have in my cabinet, and I've gone over how I've done that. There is a product out there called Ye Olde AquaFortis. Mike Lee now makes it. They sell it. Most of the gun builders, supply houses sell it. This is not a bad product. This is a reasonably good product. It is really not AquaFortis. And the reason for that is it's made with nitric acid sulfuric acid, and water, and they dissolve a certain amount of iron in it. The problem is it's highly acidic, and in most cases, you're not going to get a browns, you're not going to get reds, you're going to get blacks, and it's going to continue to darken over time. And they came up with that formula, Bill Young came up with that formula because he uses the same product in his rust browning as he does in his stain. So, but if you want to build in a southern gun and you like the house style of southern gun where that gun's going to turn black and you don't want to go through the trouble of making this product works fine. I use it, you know, sometimes. But even if I found even if you neutralize it, and I'll talk about that a little bit, it still continues to darken over time to the point where it turns almost black. So it's something that I keep in my color palette, but it's not something that I use regularly. So some things to keep in, this is now a water-based stain. So it is something that is going to raise the grain, and we talked about why I finish with all the parts on the gun is because I'm using a water-based stain, which means all those wood fibers are going to swell. So if I take all my brass off and I stain it with this stain, what's going to happen? All those inlets are going to swell up, they're going to get full of finish, and you're going to have to re-inlet all the parts on the rifle. So I finish a rifle with all the parts on the gun. And so because I use a water-based stain, I don't use any sandpaper on the wood. And my guns are all finished with hand tools, and then I finish with scrapers. And I brought a selection of my scrapers. Set them here. And this is just a small sampling of what I usually scrape with. And so there's rough scraping, which you can actually use for shaping of the stock, and then finish scraping, which you're going to do towards the end. And the reason I don't use sandpaper is this is a water-based stain. If I fill up all the pores of the wood with sawdust, it doesn't want to accept the stain. By scraping the stock, you actually open up the pores, you leave the pores of that wood open, it will absorb more stain. So you'll get more color. So cabinet scrapers are good. This selection of scrapers here are sold by Brownells. They're called Jerry Fisher stock scrapers, and they are fantastic. They're a little expensive, they're really hard, but they are able to be modified. And you'll notice most of the shapes on these I've changed to fit different portions of the firearms. And that's what I do with my rough scraping. When it comes to finish scraping, I have a selection of, actually this, finish scrapers. And these ones that I'm using, and at the end of today, you're welcome to come up and take a look at all this. These are the ones that I'm using to clean up moldings and clean around, you know, beaver tails and things like that. And most of those are made from cheap Japanese pull saws that you can buy at Home Depot. You can actually cut them if you have a really good pair of tin snips, or you can grind them. So I have a whole drawer full of these that fit almost every radius that you can think of on a gun stock. And if I don't have one, I'll run over to the grinder and pick it up, change it real quickly. One of the other good things to use that are really cheap, that are disposable, and I got this from Alan Martin, these are carpet knife blades. You get those at Home Depot, there's 100 of them in a pack, 2 blades on them. Put a piece of tape on one side so you don't cut yourself, and these make great scrapers in large areas. And you can use sheetrock knife blades. I don't happen to like those as much, but most of these scrapers, the Jerry Fisher scrapers, you're not going to roll an edge. Everybody talks about a scraper will only work if you roll an edge on it. You can't roll an edge on those Jerry Fisher scrapers. The only things, the ones that I roll edges on are these little carpet knives. And I just do that is I just run them down a big Arkansas stone, a white Arkansas translucent stone. I just pull it on there, and that rolls a nice edge. You'll notice if you look at a rifle that I build to get it in the sunlight, you'll see all those little flats. You'll see little scrape marks where I've nicked the scraper and stuff like that. And to me, that adds character to the firearm. But you can notice from the pictures here, they don't show up real well. You can scrape pretty finely and get a pretty fine finish simply with scrapers. So that's really the only finish that I do to a wood. I don't use any sandpaper. Obviously, I'm going to use it on the metal parts, but I almost never use it on the wood. And you will get a little washboarding sometimes because of the curl, because obviously you're going to pull out the softer parts of the curl and the harder parts are going to be raised. But again, to me, that adds a certain amount of character to the firearm. And anybody have any questions? So basically, yeah.
Did they use scrapers back in the day?
Absolutely. That's an argument that's been had forever. There was sandpaper available. There are records of sandpaper being imported and sold. The problem is it was pretty expensive. And if you look at a lot of original firearms, you will find scraper marks. So did some gun makers use sandpaper? Probably. Was it as much as scrapers? I don't believe so. You know, the thing is, when you start looking at cost, even for us, if we're doing this full time, the cost of sandpaper is a cost that you know is there. If you can eliminate that cost and use a scraper and get good results, you're not going to go buy sandpaper if you can just use a scraper. And most of these scrapers are 20 years old, so they don't really wear out.
So on the gun that's on the screen, right?
Yes.
And the wire inlay.
Yes.
When you're scraping it, what do you do?
You're scraping.
You scrape it right.
You scrape right over the top of the silver. As a matter of fact, when I do silver work, my basic process is I rasp everything to shape. I go to files, and then I go right to scrapers. So obviously, before you put your wire work in, you're going to scrape everything, and you're going to whisker everything. So then what's going to happen is you're going to put your wire in, and you're going to file it almost smooth to the surface. The less filing you do, the better, because you're actually scratching the surface every time you pull a curl of silver off or a curl of brass off. And I ran into this with this gun, because this inlay is actually brass. This is the first gun I did a lot of brass on. This was for the Rev War Museum in Philadelphia. And when you roll that curl of brass up with your file, you're scratching the surface of the wood, so you're adding scratches. So I try to leave it a little bit proud so I'm not scratching the wood, and then I go in with a scraper and I scrape the last little bit anyway. So, and you're running your scraper, trying to run your scraper down the length of the silver so that you're not butting up against it and building a divot in it. So, and it shows better in the photograph than up here, but all of that is brass wire. And so I'm scraping.
Yeah, you said you got some Home Depot scrapers.
It's the cheap Japanese pull saws. They make these really thin steel saws that only work on the pull. An American saw works on the push. A Japanese pull saw works on the pull. And they're like $10. They're really strange shapes. They have a funny bamboo handle on them. And it's like $10, which is enough for probably 100 scrapers. And it's tool steel, but it's really thin and flexible. Any tool steel will work. A good hand saw, if you have an old hand saw that you're not using, any type of tool steel that's thin and kind of flexible will work. I mean, thick ones work, but they take a long time to grind to shape. And so you're in the process of making a gun, you're constantly modifying your scrapers and changing them, because if your shop is like mine, you might not be able to find the one that you just used 10 minutes ago. So. And really the reason that I do the scraping as opposed to the sandpaper is really because of the type of stain. You get much better color, much better penetration, much better finish, I think, using a scraper rather than sandpaper. So I finished my gun, I've scraped the gun, I've done whiskering. And when you whisker, what you're going to do is you're going to wet it, you're going to dry it, all those fibers are going to swell up, and you're going to whisker it again. You're going to cut those all off with a scraper. You're going to go in and do that 2 or 3 times. You're going to do your carving. You're going to relieve your background. You're going to obviously whisker the background several times. And everybody asks, well, how many times do you whisker? That's really determined by the wood that you're working. If you have a really hard piece of maple, you may only have to do it 2 or 3 times. If you have a soft piece of maple, if you have a piece of walnut, American walnut, you probably never get all those whiskers to disappear. They're going to continue to swell up. And you're going to have to deal with whiskers because you're dealing with a water-based stain. So once you introduce your stain, you're going to raise the grain again. So that's going to be something that you're going to be able to determine after you've done it a few times. And I'll explain how I deal with my finer whiskers as I go through the stain process. So I finished the gun, I have my stain prepared, I've decided what color I'm going to use, and the next process is I'm going to prep the stock before I introduce my stain. And I use a product called Cleenwood. It's made by the Imperial company. Used to be every hardware store in the country had it. It's a little more difficult to find, but Ace Hardware, they can order it for you. And this is a concoction of almost every solvent known to man. It smells terrible. It's probably given us all cancer, but it's the best thing that I found, because it's a water-based stain, to get any type of fingerprints or oil from your bench or sweat or anything off of the wood before you introduce the stain. And because it's a water-based stain, if you have a drop of oil or something like that on your bench and it gets on the wood and you introduce the nitrate of iron stain, you're going to have a white spot because it's not going to take the stain. So once I'm ready, I clean my bench off completely of everything. I lay down fresh butcher paper on top of my bench so that anything that could happen to be on my bench doesn't get on the wood. And then I clean the stock with this product. And it's called Cleenwood. It's by Imperial. And most painting supply houses have it. So if you have a local paint house, because of all the VOC compliant stuff, it's a little bit more difficult to find and it's more expensive. It used to be $5 a gallon. I think it's $20 for a quart now. But doesn't smell very good, but I use a lot of it and I'm still alive. So now, if you have a piece of wood, you've done your test pieces, and this is something that Bill Knight discovered and Jim Kibler has started using and selling with his kits. If you have a piece of the basic reaction, the reason it happens is because of tannic acid in the wood. And that's one thing that's helping the stock. And if you happen to have a piece of wood that doesn't really show the figure very well, when you go to stain it, you've done your test piece, you can actually add tannic acid to the wood, and that will help bring up the color. And tannic acid is available. I think I got this in Amazon, but it's a kind of a reddish brown powder. And my formula for my tannic acid mixture is 1 tablespoon of the dry powder to 1 pint of hot tap water. And it makes a kind of a reddish brown, gray, foamy mixture. And so what I do is after the Cleenwood, then I'll paint that on the stock and let that dry completely. And you can see where you paint it because it's got a little bit of color. What's that? The formula is 1 tablespoon of the powder to 1 pint of hot tap water. I mix it up fresh because between guns it grows some really strange looking mold on it. So I mix up enough to paint on one gun and then I throw the rest out. So I don't store it. I don't know whether the moldy stuff will work or not. I never tried it. I just threw it out. But
it's not very expensive.
it's cheap. It's really cheap. And then I'm going to add my first coat of stain, and that's my nitrate of iron stain. So I put the tannic acid on. I allow it to completely dry. I put the first coat of nitrate of iron stain on, and I allow it to completely dry. And then I'm going to blush it, and that blushing requires heat, and I use just a painter's paint gun. You want to be really, really careful not to singe the high spots, because, you know, up on the top of your lock panels, the top of your Jeep piece, if you burn that or scorch that, you're going to have to restain that area. And so you want to keep it moving, and you will notice that it blushes. I will warn you ahead of time that if you put tannic acid on your stock is now going to turn black. It's scary the first time you do it. I mean, it just gets dark. If I don't use tannic acid, I still get a pretty deep purple color. And don't be afraid of it. You haven't messed up, you're on the right track. So, and I put 2 coats of stain on. So my process is I put the first coat of stain on, I let it dry completely. I blush it with the heat gun. When that's cooled off, I will go with a second coat of stain, let it dry completely, and then I hit it with the heat gun. And I really don't find that more coats of stain give you better color or whatever, but usually I discover when I blush it that I missed someplace on the stock and I have a white spot. So in order to go back in, I don't want to just do one single little spot because that might give you some color variation. So I go over the whole stock again, making sure that I got any spots that I missed the first time. So I don't ever stain more than twice. All right. Once you've reached that stage where you have blushed it twice, obviously you now have raised the grain again. So the product that I use, and I use a lot of this stuff in the shop, is a Scotch-Brite pad. This is one of the few non-traditional products that I use that I really, really like. And this is 3M's number 7448. Because there's a couple, it's a light gray or a dark gray, but the number's more important because they have a bunch of grays. That is the number. So then I take a piece of this and I go over the whole stock. And it's almost a cross between sanding and varnishing. You'll notice that the stock will start to shine a little bit. And I go over the whole stock. And looking at the stock now, you're all covered in dust. You've generated dust. So I'm a person and it neutralizes my nitrate of iron stain. And some people say you don't have to neutralize it if it's not acidic. A lot of the guys that use the ferric nitrate crystals say they don't neutralize. I neutralize. And what I use for neutralization is household ammonia. I don't like the baking soda and water because it leaves a white residue behind. So what I've done is I go through and I polish off all my whiskers with the Scotch-Brite pad. I take a rag, I soak it in household ammonia. I go over the whole stock and I use that as a tack cloth, and that's going to take all that dust off. So I'm using the ammonia to both neutralize the acid, whatever acidity I have left in my stain, and it tends to hold the color. And I also found that one of the neat side effects is I start to get red tones from using the ammonia for whatever reason is. And I'll explain that the iron that's on a molecular level in the nitrate of iron stain is actually where your color comes from. That color it's the iron pigment. It's the color of that rust, basically, is what's giving you the color of the stock. And what happens is the soft portions of the stock in that curl is going to absorb more of the stain than the tight closed ones. So then that's where you get your contrast between, the light and the dark, and that's where the stripes come from. I use nitrate of iron stain on American walnut. I get really good results with that, and I forgot the picture this time, but I get golden undertones in American walnut when I use the nitrate of iron stain. Not everybody gets good results with it, so everything that I'm saying, experiment with a little bit, So that's my basic process. Does anybody have any questions about that, how I go about it? Okay, so I've stained my stock, I've blushed it twice, I've neutralized my stock, and basically next comes stock finish. And the very first thing that I apply to my stock is SeedLac. And this serves two purposes. The first thing is if I'm working on a piece of walnut, it freezes a lot of those whiskers. So I can go back in and cut those whiskers off because it actually hardens a little bit. The other thing is if you're using a linseed oil-based stain, and if you have nitrate of iron stain, or if you use Track of the Wolf stuff that's a little acidic, the acid will actually soften linseed oil-based stains. It saponifies the linseed oil base. Basically, you're making soap. What the SeedLac does is it acts as a barrier between the acidity, residual acidity in the wood, and whatever top finish you won't use. So I use SeedLac. I buy it in crystals like this. I mix it with alcohol, obviously, is the base. I use a real thin cut. I think it's like a 1 pound or a 2 pound cut. And the big thing about it is don't buy hardware store bullseye shellac, and don't keep any shellac in your shop older than 6 months. And the reason is the alcohol absorbs moisture out of the atmosphere and it'll never dry. So and that's why Zinsser shelf-based shellac, it will soften, and that's because it's been on the shelf for too long. So I buy the SeedLac crystals. It's all full of, lac is a natural product from the lac bug. So there's all kinds of little tree branches and leaves and all kinds of other stuff in here. So I'll mix up enough for the next month or two. I'll strain it through cheesecloth, and then I'll just put a date on the top of the container. And then that's good for 6 months. So the very first layer of stuff that I'm going to put on is shellac, and that's the reason for that. If you study 18th century furniture, 18th century furniture makers a lot used a combination of a first coat of shellac, and the second coat was a linseed oil-based varnish. And they were doing that, and it's more scientific than I understand, but it has to do with how water penetrates the surface, that those two finishes combined make a more waterproof finish than either one of them do on their own. And it's one absorbs, or one repels atmospheric moisture, and the other repels raindrops. And a guy at Williamsburg, I think Wallace Gussler, explained it to me one time, and it's lost. The exact thing is lost in my memory. I just know it works. So then for a top coat, I have probably 3 or 4 different top coats that I use. And this is going to depend on the gun that I'm building, the customer that I'm building it for. So I'm going to ask the customer a number of questions. If he is a collector and he wants as historically correct finish as he can get, and he's going to hang it on his wall in his house, I'm probably going to use a product like tried and true varnish oil, which is a polymerized linseed oil based finish. Today's linseed oil is totally different from the linseed oil from the 18th century. It's 2 different totally animals. So the linseed oil that you buy in the hardware store is not a particularly good gun finish. It's not particularly durable, and it is slow to dry. And you'll read all kinds of things where they say, well, the gun maker puts on a coat a day for a week, and then a coat a week for a month, and then a coat of every 6 months. No gun maker in any place who's trying to make a living is going to spend weeks trying to finish his gun. He's going to finish something that as quickly as he can. In the 18th century, what they would do was they would boil linseed oil with lead, and the lead acted as a dryer. The lead was actually what made the linseed oil polymerize. I don't know what tried and true uses with theirs, but I know that it does dry. The key to getting a linseed oil-based finish to dry is sunlight. And if it's 45 degrees up or higher anywhere, my guns hang outside in a little corner of my house where they're protected from the wind, but they get sunlight for a good portion of the day. So that the key, you don't ever want to put a second coat of any finish on top of a first coat that hasn't completely dried. You're just going to end up with a mess down the road. So if it doesn't completely dry, wait a while. UV light, sunlight, it is really the key to a linseed oil-based finish. The only downside to the linseed oil-based finishes is they're not terribly durable. And Track of the Wolf sells a linseed oil-based stain that works great. It's easy to use. It looks beautiful. I don't know if they still carry it, but I did one of my first guns with it. I went deer hunting and I wore the finish off in a day wearing a pair of wool gloves. I mean, right down to the wood. It just stripped the combination of the snow and the wool stripped the gun in about 6 hours. So I'm not a huge fan of linseed-based finish for somebody who's going to hunt. So if I know that the person is an avid hunter, he's somebody who's a regular shooter, I'm going to recommend to him a more durable finish. And in most cases, that's going to be a tung oil-based finish. Tung oil is not particularly historically correct, but it is a much more durable finish than a linseed-based finish. And it has the added benefit is most of them will dry within 24 hours. So you can put a coat on a day. And I use several different linseed oil-based finishes. One of the best ones out, tung oil-based finishes. One of the best ones out there is Jim Chambers' finish. If I have a gun that the customer or I want a red hue to, Jim's finishes are the way to go. He won't tell anybody what's in there. I know it's tung oil based. I suspect that it's probably a Jim floor sealer of some kind that's very durable, but it does have a beautiful red color. So if I'm trying to finish a gun that's got a red hue, I'm going to use my wrought iron based nitrate of iron stain, and I'm going to use Jim's finish. The other one that I really like, and this one is an amber color, and this one is sold by Brownells. It's called Gun Savers Hand Rubbing Gun Stock Finish, and it's available from them, and it's an amber color, and it's also probably a tung oil based finish. Always buy a gloss finish. No matter what product that you're going to buy, you always want to buy a gloss finish. In a matte finish, they have things in there, matting agents, that will obscure the color of your stain. So you're always going to want to finish with a gloss and then knock that gloss back, and I'll explain to you how I knock the gloss back. But
What was that one called again?
it's called Gun Savers CP Hand Rubbing Gun Stock Finish, clear gloss. And those are really my main stains. I don't, a lot of people ask me about Permalin, which is a stain that's very popular. I do not use it. I don't care for it. It is probably the most durable stain out there. So if you're looking for a stain that's going to last a long, long time, you're never going to have to refinish it. Talk to somebody like Bill Shipman, who uses it exclusively, and he can tell you how to use it. But I don't care for Permalin. It has a very plastic look to me, but it's not something that I work with. The only other finish that I use, and I use this most often on walnut, American walnut's very porous, is McCluskey's Man of War Spar Varnish. And this is probably the most durable finish that I use. I thin it usually 50% with turpentine before I apply it. I don't ever use this on a gun that has a lot of raised carving though. And the reason is it's almost impossible to get out of the crevices in raised carving. It's a very thick stain. I like it in American walnut because it fills the pores. And one of the other things that I do if I'm working in American walnut is if I want the contrast, and this works in American and European, is I use a paste wood filler, and this is available through Constantine's. Jim Chambers had it for a while. I don't know if he still has it or not. But this is a black paste filler, and you rub it in, and that fills the pores, particularly American walnut, and then you can rub it back and you get the color, but you get the pores are a nice black color. You can do that by using the spar varnish and just rubbing it back and using several coats. So either way works. The filling of the grain works a little bit faster. But this is a very durable finish. It fills pores quickly, but it's really tough to work with if you have a lot of raised carbon because it's just so thick. And it is also a tung oil based. It does have some UV stuff in it to protect from UV, so it probably helps with your stain fade a little bit. But so those are really the
ratio on that again?
What's that?
Ratio?
I usually cut it 50% with turpentine. And before I put this on, I'm still going to put my coat of SeedLac. So no matter which of these finishes that I use, my first coat is always a coat of SeedLac. And if you look at 18th century guns never have any finish inside the lock mortise. They're never going to have any finish inside the gun barrel or the patch box cavity. And you will hear people say they put axle grease in the barrel channel and all this other stuff. The only thing I do is that spit coat of SeedLac, I'll put inside the barrel channel, the lock mortise, and the patch box cavity. Do not put it in under the butt plate.
Why?
The reason is it soaks up the finish, it dries, and the wood will now be proud of your butt plate. So I'll give you that little tip that'll save you a whole lot of time because I did it once and I'll never do it again. So the end grain under the butt plate stays unfinished because whatever you put in there is going to swell that butt and it's going to be proud of your butt plate. So.
What was the name of that filler?
The filler here is Constantine's Paste Wood Filler, black. And it's used a lot in the furniture industry. I don't know how available it is. Constantine's been sold a couple times but there is somebody out there that must make it. So I don't use a lot of it, as you can see, because this has been around.
There was an outfit that put out a product called Red Liquid Filler.
Yes.
And they went out of business and they didn't, it's back on the market.
Okay.
And that for
English guns were traditionally finished with either red filler or black filler. And Constantine's used to make a red filler. So that company hopefully
they're
does
back
make
in business.
good. So it should be available. So anybody have any questions about that so far?
You don't worry about water coming up, entering the bucket.
No. 18th century guns have been around for 200 years. They were never sealed under the butt plate. They were never sealed in the patch box cavity, the lock mortise, or the barrel channel. They didn't seal under the ramrod pipes. And if my guns are still working or still around in 200 years, I'm happy with that. No. And the only reason I do, you will see in original guns where the oil from the lock has started to eat away the wood, the breech a little bit. So I use the SeedLac in there just to make myself feel a little better about it. I never use any type of bedding compound or anything like that. Your actual barrel inlets and stuff like that don't have to be that tight for a muzzleloading firearm. If you look at 18th century barrel channels, a lot of them are round. The only place that they're really touching is at the breech and at the muzzle. And what's in between a lot of times is not touching, and those guns shot really well. So this notion that you have to bed an action of a muzzleloading firearm is kind of goes against what I believe in as a builder. But
Herders is the name of the
yes, Herders is one of the companies that did it. So that's basically my finish. Now, a lot of questions. Go ahead.
Like, when you shoot the gun, like everything you make with a little core,
Yep.
where's the way, and next thing you know, you've got no stain on it. I mean, is that the stain wearing away, or the finish, or combination?
That's the finish, probably.
And that stuff you said earlier, is that what you use to get it so that they don't wear away?
Yeah, a tongue oil based finish. If you're a hunter, you probably want to stay away from the linseed based finishes and go with a tongue oil based finish. And kind of the next question is, it always comes up, is how many coats of finish do you use? And I can't answer that because that's based on the gun and that's based on the wood, and that also is based on the patina that I'm going to introduce in the firearm. So if you look at this particular firearm, and it's hard to see, you can come up and look at the pictures. There's a certain amount of blackness in here. There's a certain amount of blackness underneath. And that's what we all love to call patina. And, you know, the argument is, should you age a gun, don't age a gun? That argument's been going on in our community for a long time. I'm personally, my clients want, in many types, a gun with some patina, some age. I don't beat the daylights out of the gun. I don't want to make it look like I dragged it behind my truck for a month. But I do introduce a certain amount of wear and patina in my firearms. And that's, you know, my firearms end up looking like my firearms, which is what I want. So adding patina is part of the finishing process because I'm adding that patina as I'm finishing a gun. I don't finish a gun and then decide, well, now I'm going to add patina. I'll usually put probably 3 or 4 coats of finish on and start to fill my pores, get my pores filled, and get a nice even finish. And so then I'm going to start introducing some color, some interest in my firearm. And the main thing that I'm adding into the finish is expensive dirt. And this is just dry pigments. And you can get them at any artist supply store. I brought along just a few that I have. This is a black. And, you know, black is good, but if you look at dirt on an original firearm, it's generally not pitch black. It's not that dark bent black. It's usually got a little brownish, blackish color, and it's going to vary depending on where the gun has been and where it's been. So a lot of people just use straight lamp black, and I think you're doing yourself a disservice. Add some other colors. I use burnt umber, raw umber. I'll use some reds. This is iron oxide pigment. And what I'm going to do, there's 2 different ways of introducing the pigment, and I use them both. And the first way is, You can either do it dry, introduce the dry pigment into your wet finish, or what I generally do is I actually grind the pigment into my finish. And I have a big piece of plate glass in my shop, and I have what painters use to mold their pigment into their paint when they're making their own colors. And so what I'll do is I'll put some drops of my finish, my chambers, whatever I'm gonna do, on that glass plate. I'll put whatever red or brown or whatever dry color, and that's where the mad scientist comes in. And then you'll actually grind that pigment into the finish. And what that's doing is you're actually making the size of the pigment, you know, granules smaller, but you're making a nice even color. And then I rub all my finish on with my hands. I don't use brushes. So I'll rub that finish on. I'll let it dry completely. And then I'm in between my coats, I'm rubbing back the finish wet with a little bit of Scotch-Brite. So I'll take a little piece of Scotch-Brite and I'll dab that into my, whatever my finish is, and I'll rub over that stock, and I'll wear away where my hand's gonna be, where my cheek is gonna hit the cheek piece. You wanna be real careful not to wear through your finish and get into your stain on the high points. This stuff can cut pretty fast, particularly if it's wet. And I'll wear away where I want that to be. The second method that you can use is you put the wet finish on, you steal a couple of makeup brushes from your wife when she's not looking, and you can dab those in the dry pigment and then just puff it onto the finish. And if you have an area where you want it to kind of look crusty, where a piece of finish is maybe flaked away or it cracked or crazed, you can build up, you know, kind of like a muddy mortar, so to speak, out of your dry pigment on that wet finish. So if you have like under the cheek piece there, you want a little bit of crustiness or something in there, or you want it on an inlay somewhere where underneath the barrel where it's not going to get a lot of hand rubbing. And this is something this is part of the artistic end of it. You're going to have to decide, well, where was this hunter rubbing it? Where was it wearing on the saddle, whatever. And you're going to add pigment, take it away, add pigment, take it away. And, you know, I can have as many as 11 or 12, 14, 15 coats on until I get the firearm to the level that I want it, and what I want, and what my customer wants.
You still have all your hardware on at that point.
Hardware's always on it. I don't ever want to re-inlet anything. So yes, my hardware is now covered with finish. I don't do any final polish on my hardware until after the firearm is completed. And in some guns, what I'll actually do is I'll get it to almost to the point where I want. I'll pull all the hardware off, clean it, polish it, age it however I want to age it, put it back on, and then that last couple of coats with finish, I'm filling in a little bit of pigment, you know, in the trigger guard there where it's not going to get touched. I'll add a little bit of pigment to the hardware and rub that back. So you're actually getting a little bit of crust and stuff like that on the hardware. And, but I always try to finish with almost all the hardware attached to the firearm. Barrel is almost always in it. Barrel's probably the only thing that's not in it all the time, because when I hang it outside in the sunlight, I put a wire through the front where the first ramrod pipe is, and that's how I hang it outside. So generally the barrel's not going to be in it. So that's probably the only thing that's not.
When you're finishing American walnut, if you're using a hand or a spar bar.
Yes.
Do you put that many coats on?
No.
Okay.
No. Spar varnish, even if I'm aging it, I'm probably not going to get more than, well, it depends. If it's a real porous piece, I might have to do 6 coats before I do any patina just to fill the pores. So again, it's something, but no. The spar varnish really builds up in the corners. Even a simple piece of walnut, you know, you're going to have probably a molding or two. You probably, you know, you're not going to heavily carve porous walnut because it's just going to drive you crazy. So yeah, no, with the spar varnish builds up a lot quicker. So the nice thing about some of these others are they're thin enough that you can really play with it. But you can take a lot of finish off real quickly if you have the Scotch-Brite and it's a wet finish. You can cut through. You got to be careful because you can cut through. You'll be surprised. You'll put that coat on there and that gun will be pitch black, and you'll go pop, and it comes right off. Your hands will be black. It'll be a mess, but it really makes for an interesting piece. So those are the two ways. You can do it dry, you can mold the pigment into the finish, and so now you're at the point where you've got all your coats of finish on, it's thoroughly dry, and it's glossy, and you don't want a glossy gun. So you're going to want to rub that finish out with something. And what I use is rotten stone. This is a powdered abrasive pumice stone, and this stuff comes in 4 grades, 2F and 4F. The 2 is the most abrasive, the 4 is the medium, and the rotten stone is the finest. And I mix that with what they call a non-blooming oil, it's just paraffin oil. And I mix that into a loose paste mixture. And this stuff can cut really fast. So what I use, I don't use it on a rag, I don't use it on a felt pad. Furniture guys use it on a felt pad. I use it on a toothbrush. And so I have a bunch of real ratty toothbrushes. And I use these a lot in between finishing. This is what I use to get the wet finish out of my carving. So when I am putting finish on, and I put a finish on over my carving, it's going to want to pull up in the crevices, and I don't want that because I spend all that time making my carving as crisp as I can. So I'm in there with a toothbrush scrubbing all that out before the finish really hardens up. And I do the same thing with the rub out stuff. Because I just put it on the toothbrush and I scrub all of that off. It keeps you from taking finish off of all the high points. If you get on there with a rag and you have this stuff, you'll cut through your finish, and you'll actually, after a while, you'll start to see wood. So one of the best things is just a bunch of cheap toothbrushes and use those for any type of work like that on your stock. And that's how I get the stock to have kind of a matte finish. I don't like a real shiny stock. And it'll get shiny enough over time and through use and things like that. Everybody, you look at original guns and everybody says, well, they had a high gloss finish. Well, that gun's probably been refinished 4 or 5 times.
How do you decide which one of the?
You start with the coarsest if you need it. Usually I don't ever need the coarsest on anything but walnut. Because walnut, you'd never really get rid of the whiskers. By using the finish, you've frozen all those whiskers, and just the tips of those whiskers are showing. So you may want to rub that out. That might be the only place where you might want to use a felt pad if you want to flatten that finish out a little bit. Again, we had this. I studied with Wallace Gussler and Gary Brumfield down in Bowling Green, Kentucky a lot, and they always had this saying that they used was finished in a workmanlike manner. And that doesn't mean to do shoddy work or poor work, but these guys were trying to make a living. And they weren't building guns for the King and the Queen of England. They were building stuff for the common man, and they had to reach a price point. So, the talk about tool marks and things like that, those are all stuff that you're going to find on original firearms. And it's not necessarily that you're doing poor work. They were under time constraints. And to me, things like that add interest to a firearm. So, for me, that's important.
But they knew what they were doing too.
Yeah.
I mean, after your furniture,
Yeah.
workmanlike manner was.
Yep.
Segregation.
But I mean, you look at some of the originals up there. You go look at some of those Jacob George guns. They're pretty rough, and they're beautiful because they're faux part, and that's what makes them beautiful. So we're not building modern firearms that require English guns and things like that. But obviously, if you're building a high-end English Fowler, you're building a Jaeger for the king or the queen, you're going to spend a lot more time on your finish work, and a lot of this stuff, like the patina and stuff like that, isn't going to be pertinent. But and then once the finish is completely dry, I put paste wax over everything, and I put the paste wax on the metalwork and paste wax on all the woodwork, and that's really all I do. I put wax on about every 6 months with my firearms. And the 2 waxes that I like the best is Brie wax, which is a furniture wax. It's available. I know it's available on Amazon because this was $5 a can when I first started buying it. It's now $25, but it's an excellent wax. There's also a product that I just started using that the museums use called Renaissance wax. It's also an excellent wax. Please don't use car wax. Carnauba waxes turn white, and it's going to turn white in all the crevices of the firearm. So The last thing that I do is a nice coat of paste wax over everything, and that's basically the firearm is finished.
What about old Johnsons?
I've never used it, so I won't comment on a product that I never used. So I come from a cabinet shop background. That's where I started my life. And brie wax was something that we used tons of. So it's something that I'm very familiar with.
You ever used colored brie waxes or just?
Yes. Colored brie waxes are great. Now, one of the greatest things about colored brie waxes, particularly dark ones, is they'll cover up inletting mistakes. So if you have a little spot that's got a little bit of a gap on an inlet on your hunter star, I am totally against epoxies and fillers and all kinds of things like that. But a little bit of dark colored paste wax covers up, a lot of sins. So yeah, no, I use a lot of colored paste wax. And the other thing that I've done is mixed pigment in with the paste wax. So I take and dump some dry pigment in there and stir it up and give that wax some body and some hold to it, and use that in instances where, because it's reversible, and I use that a lot in restoration work. So it's something that is just another tool in your palette of arsenal. Does anybody have any questions about it?
Sure.
Okay, I skipped over that because I'm going to come into the end. Let me see if I can find the formula here. I know it's here. Here we go. Okay, cherry is something that you can age cherry a little bit by using a lye solution. And you can get lye still in the hardware store. And my mixture for a lye solution is a half teaspoon of crystals to a half pint of water. And I mix that up, you paint it on the stock, and it turns a nice deep red. If everybody knows old cherry furniture, it gets that nice deep red color. And if I'm going to age cherry, that's what I use. Cherry is nice because in most cases it's dense, it takes a finish real well. It's a little bit of a pain to carve, but it does take finish well. And then I do the same patina. It's recommended by many people that use it, particularly in the furniture industry, that you neutralize the cherry or the lye. And they use 1 part vinegar to 2 parts water. I will warn you that sometimes, depending on the piece of wood, it becomes the most hideous orange color. Okay? And if that happens, you're going to have to put the lye on again and just not neutralize that stock. And I've only ever had one stock do that to me, and it was for a client I built about 6 tons for. I put the lye on there, I put the neutralizer on there, and I got Bozo the Clown orange out of that stock. And sometimes things don't go as planned, and that's, covering over your mistakes or whatever is part of this.
Have you used EZO?
I have not. I am building a New England gun, hopefully for a client next year, and I'm going to actually try UV lights. There's a guy down in Kentucky that, because it's UV is what makes natural cherry get that beautiful red color. And he's actually experimented in using grow lights to age cherry. So that's where I'm going to go with the next cherry gun that I build. What's that?
Neutralize it with 1 part vinegar to what?
1 part vinegar to 2 parts water. Yeah.
What were they using on the cherry?
Lye.
Something lights.
Oh, UV.
Oh, UV lights, grow lights. What they use for starting seeds and greenhouses and stuff like that.
Have you ever tried just putting it out in the sun?
I have, but again, it's a slow process.
Yeah, slow.
And the other problem I found was it was uneven.
You have to almost rotate
yeah,
that.
yeah.
Because you put a table out, you
Yep.
set something on it, you'll
Yeah,
shadow it.
and don't put anything on it when you set it
you'll
out.
shadow it.
Yeah, yeah. So it's really a how much time you have. Most of us who are builders are always behind the gun because we're past our delivery dates. So you're trying to work with ways that you can speed up the process. But again, it's something I experiment with. So
The lye mixture is the stain.
that lye mixture isn't stained. I don't ever use nitrate. I've never used nitrate of iron stain on cherry. I experimented with it, and all I got was black. Nitrate of iron stain works beautifully on ash, though. So So that's one of the other woods that it works for. I haven't done an ash gun yet, but I have a piece of beautiful curly ash, and when I do it, that's what I'll use on the ash.
And the finishing after the staining on cherry
Is the same. I'm still, once the lye is done, I'm still gonna put my coat of SeedLac on there, and then my top finish. So, the last thing that I want to talk about, and since I'm the last class, I get to run late, is artificial striping. And I have an original Lancaster up here. It was probably made from parts that were stolen out of the Leman shop in Lancaster and purchased and sold to a local farmer who happens to be a relation of mine. And it's a little bit faded, but you can come up and take a look at it. And if you follow the internet forums, everybody says, oh, they did that internet, they wrapped a cord around there and they soaked it in gasoline and they set it on fire, or they wrapped it in tape and hit it with a torch, and that's what they got the striping on. Well, I respectfully disagree. And if you look at the original firearm here, it was obviously done with a brush. I've seen the brushes, I have 2 of these, and I've studied a bunch of others. The brush usually have between 5 and 7 teeth on it, okay? From oral history, we believe that most of the people that were painting these firearms were women, and it was a cottage industry. They would take the stocks home and paint them at home generally, and then bring them back to the Leman factory, which is how the parts were disappearing out of the back. So I was commissioned, of all things, to build a faux striped blunderbuss. Don't ask me why, but it's a good client. With a flip-out bayonet, no less. But he wanted it faux finished, and his concept was it was a blunderbuss that ended up getting restocked in Lancaster and headed west because he found some trade records for blunderbusses being out west. And so I just wanted to kind of go over how I did it and show you the tools that I used. Now, the first thing, this gun, I stained this gun with nitric acid, but I didn't use nitrate of iron stain. One of my friends, James Rogers, has done a lot of experimenting with using just nitric acid and water as a gun stain. And since I really didn't care about contrast between curl, because the piece of wood that I was using had no curl, I stained this with a solution of 10% nitric acid and 90% water, with no iron added into it. And I followed the same thing. I painted it on, and you can come up and look at the pictures. It's a pretty nice brown color. And that was my base color. And I did two coats, and then I experimented a lot, and I found that I needed to seal the stock with shellac, otherwise the striping ran too much, and it didn't look like the striping on the original. So once I was finished with staining, I still put my SeedLac on, and that held the India ink, which is what I used to paint that on with. And I found that regular Higgins India ink, which isn't the real black color, they make one that's, I think they call ultra black or jet black or something, that color was too black. I tried some different browns, and the browns didn't quite match what I had, so I went with just basic everyday Higgins ink. And I took some good quality paintbrushes. I found that poor quality paintbrushes didn't work. And I made little teeth, notch teeth, and I made a 5 and a 7. Actually, I think they're both 7s, just different sizes. But 5 and 7 seems to be the repeatable number on the brushes that the women were using in Lancaster. And you dip it in the India ink, and you just drew the stripes on. And a lot of times they overlapped. If you look at this firearm, you know, it's one stripe overlapped the other stripe, and they just went all the way around. And that's what I painted the stripes on with that firearm. And then I proceeded to finish it. And I did wear the stripes off a lot to show some wear on the firearm. The stripes were quite a bit bolder before I started the rubbing process. But that's how these firearms, I'm pretty sure, were done. And if you wanted to do a faux stripe rifle, I would suggest you do that rather than setting fire to some tar soda pro. So, and then once that was done, then I just put my finish right over the top of that. Don't go through and put shellac over the top of the India ink, because they're both alcohol based and it'll run. So just go straight to your finish. Question? And that's basically how I finish, start to finish. I modify steps over time. If, you know, try the Tanic Acid, but don't use it without trying it on the piece of wood that you're going to use. It can turn a stock. If the wood already has a lot of Tanic Acid in it, you don't need it. And anybody have any questions? About it? Yep.
If you do use the Tanic Acid and it gets too dark on
You have to rub it back.
you, rub it back.
Yep. And that's a lot of times with the first. If I use Tanic Acid after my first coat of stain, once I blush it, it's black. It's really black. So usually what I'll do is if I want to rub it back before I stain it again, I will take some mineral spirits as my wetting agent and go over it with a Scotch-Brite pad. And I can start to rub it back right there. And if you're going to patina the firearm, you can start with your stuff right there. You can rub that black out where your hand's going to be, where your cheek piece is going to be, and you can leave it under the cheek piece. I mean, you've already started to patina the firearm at that point. Then you go through and put your second coat of nitrate of iron stain on, and it's not going to get that black. The second time around, you've kind of used up the Tanic Acid. I've never, ever, well, once. I experimented with putting 2 coats of Tanic Acid on. I'll never do that again. So 1 coat of Tanic Acid, 2 coats of stain is all I ever do.
What happened when 2 coats of?
It got so black, it was black and it was muddy and it destroyed the color. I actually ended up scraping the stock down and starting over again.
Scotch-Brite, you ever hear of that? Rubbing it back?
I have not.
You use Scotch-Brite and minerals?
Before I get to the finishing process, if I'm in the finishing process, see, I don't want to introduce anything before I put my SeedLac on. So that what the mineral spirits is before I'm putting my seal coat on. So then I want it to disappear, so I'm using mineral spirits. I don't want to use vinegar or anything that's going to introduce moisture to the stock, because I'm going to introduce a lot of moisture already when I do the nitrate of iron stain, because it is a water-based stain.
I know how many years ago, 70 years ago, more probably, I really got an egg curl that went into the, I used the AquaFortis.
Yep.
2 years.
You're going to have to scrape it back probably to the point where you're going to have to restain it,
Okay.
because you're going to want to make sure that all of that finish, there's no trace of finish. I would probably strip it first, use a paint stripper like Rock Miracle or something like that, and then scrape it to get the stain off. So you're pulling the finish off first, and then the problem, as I mentioned with the AquaFortis, it's really acidic, and if you don't want it to change, I only use it when I want it to go black. But you're gonna I would neutralize it for sure.
Yeah, well, I didn't know about
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
So, but it does make them black.
yes, it does.
So,
And if you're building a gun that you're trying to make a Woodbury style firearm like Herschel and John and Frank do, it's a perfect product to use and it's readily available. But it's going to turn dark, and it's going to continue to turn dark. And even if you neutralize, like my stains, I have a gun up there on my table that was copied from the Woods Runner rifle probably 15 years ago, and it used to be a real reddish stock, and it's now a brown stock. And it's darkened a little bit, but it hasn't darkened a lot in 15 years. So it changes shade a little bit, but I lost some of the red. But it still is, you can see the curl, it hasn't gone black. Any other questions?
How do you get Prussian glue off the wood?
Don't put it on in the first place.
Too late.
I would try the Cleenwood. I think that's probably the only thing that's going to pick it off. Using it for inletting? Yeah. Yeah, I use, the product that I use for inletting that I love is Jarrow's Inletting Gold. I don't ever use the black. I like the gold, it stays put, and they introduced it for walnut, but I use it on everything. And that's the product that I like, but they're oil-based, so I would attack it with the Cleenwood to see if you can you scrape it off the surface, maybe? Yeah, I would try scraping it, and then whatever's left residual, I would try to leach out with the Cleenwood. Any other questions? You're welcome to come up and look at the tools and the firearm and the photographs, and I'd be glad to answer any questions you might have.